I don't know how long it was. I think it was about half an hour. And it was traumatizing because you couldn't look left or right. You were walking through a tunnel of grief. And there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And you walked through a different section and there'd be a different reaction. So I remember once, you could walk for 300 paces through silence. And then somebody would start wailing and people would start really sobbing and crying out really lovely things to William and Harry. But it was very, very emotional. And I just thought, goodness, I hope behind his mum's body.
What if the world's most watched funeral had a secret that stayed locked away for 30 years? Imagine a royal family's heart-shattering moment that, in the shadows, carried truths that none dared to speak. In the days after the world's grief, Princess Diana's brother Spencer finally steps into the light, ready to unveil the hidden details that have haunted us all. From the sorrowful procession that brought millions of Londoners to their knees, to the moments behind closed doors when the royals first learned of her death, Spencer is revealing the facts that challenge everything we thought we knew. Join us as we uncover the chilling reality of a day that stunned a nation, and how a brother's confession is rewriting the narrative of an icon's final journey. This is the story that has been waiting for 30 years to be told. When the world first learned that Princess Diana had died, a silence fell over the nation that felt as heavy as the clouds over Kensington Palace. Yet behind that hushed grief there were unseen currents of anger, disbelief, and a deep sense that something far more personal had unfolded that day. A man who had walked beside Diana since she was a child, who had shared in her triumphs and her private sorrows, stepped into the center of a storm that would forever change the narrative of the royal family and the lives of William and Harry. It was the day after her funeral, the very day she was laid to rest beneath the stone and in the shadows of Westminster Abbey. Spencer, her younger brother, walked through the dimly lit corridors of the church, his footsteps echoing in a space that still smelled of lilies and grief. He had spent the previous day on his knees beside her coffin, his mind replaying every conversation they had shared, every secret they had kept from the world. He was the only one who could say with certainty that Diana had not wished for her sons to march before her. And that truth had been hidden behind closed doors, never spoken aloud, never recorded in any public statement. The funeral procession on the morning of September 6, 1997, had unfolded like a scene from a tragedy. People from every corner of the globe stood shoulder to shoulder along the streets of London, their faces streaked with tears. Thousands had gathered to pay their respects to a woman who had become a symbol of compassion, someone who had shown the world that vulnerability could coexist with strength. But among the throng of mourners, the most striking image was that of the two young princes, William, barely 15, and Harry, only 12, walking in solemn procession behind their mother's coffin. For the boys, the march was a moment that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Their faces were a study in stoicism, their eyes downcast, every step a quiet battle against the weight of grief that seemed to press upon them from all sides. They had never chosen to be on that path. It was a decision made by those who believed it would give them a dignified farewell. But as they walked, the world watched, and cameras zoomed in, capturing the subtle tremors that slipped between their lips, the small shivers that betrayed a deeper sorrow. Spencer had known from the very first conversation with a Buckingham Palace courtier that the plan had been to include the boys in the procession. He had heard the words spoken with casual certainty, and his heart had gone cold. The image of two young boys, still raw from their own losses, being led before a crowd of grieving strangers seemed, to him, cruel. He had no doubt that Diana would have opposed such a spectacle. Yet the decision had already been made, and the palace had turned away his pleas. "It has been decided," the courtier had said. "They will march." Spencer had fought back, arguing that it would be an unnecessary public spectacle that would put the boys in a position of painful vulnerability. But his protests fell on deaf ears, the decision already sealed. Later that evening, a lie had slipped into their conversation. The courtier had said that the boys themselves had wanted to walk in the procession. The revelation of this truth was a shock that reverberated through Spencer's thoughts. He had believed, in good faith, that they were honoring their nephew's wishes. It was only when Prince Harry later admitted that the boys had never been given a choice that the reality became stark. Harry, then a child who had no power to refuse, had simply followed orders, unaware that the decision had been made for him. The morning of the funeral was a day heavy with sorrow. People stood outside Kensington Palace holding flowers, handwritten notes, photographs of Diana that had once seemed ordinary. Their grief was tangible, a palpable pressure that seemed to make the air thick. In that same moment, Charles Spencer walked alongside Prince Charles and Prince Philip, the two boys, and the cameras focused on their faces, capturing the pale, restrained expressions that spoke of inner turmoil. The walk from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey was long and filled with the weight of expectations. The boys stood rigid, never breaking the silence, their faces the very picture of composure. Harry later described the experience as numb, as if his emotions had shut down, a feeling that left him detached from the reality around him. For Spencer, the pain was not only about losing his sister, it was about witnessing what he saw as an injustice. He had been the only one who could have stood up for the boys, who had fought so hard to protect them from the public gaze. Yet he was powerless, his pleas swallowed by the institution that had become a monolith. Later that day, as the world turned its attention toward the solemnity of the funeral, Spencer rose to deliver a speech that would become one of the most powerful moments in modern royal history. He did not speak of Diana in the traditional sense. He spoke for her, a stand that was both intimate and confrontational. He described her as the most hunted person of the modern age, a victim of a media landscape that had relentlessly pursued her. He held the royal family to account for failing to protect her from the constant scrutiny. The Queen's stoic composure did little to mitigate the impact of his words. Prince Charles remained calm, perhaps because of his own training, while the rest of the world felt the sting of Spencer's accusations. The climax of the speech was a pledge that reverberated throughout the crowd in Westminster Abbey, that the Blood family, not the Windsor dynasty, would protect and guide William and Harry. This was a direct challenge to the authority of the monarchy, a declaration that the brothers would no longer be left entirely in the hands of an institution that had previously made decisions for them without their consent. The response was rare, an outpouring of spontaneous applause that had never before been seen at a royal funeral. The audience, ranging from dignitaries to celebrities, clapped in solidarity with Spencer's conviction, acknowledging the injustice he had highlighted. In the days that followed, Spencer would admit that keeping that promise would prove impossible. William and Harry were already deeply entrenched in the royal system. The monarchy's influence over their future was far too great for Spencer to alter. He could not raise them in the manner Diana might have wished, nor could he withdraw them from the path laid out for them. The responsibility for their upbringing and protection remained firmly within the walls of the palace. Years later, Prince Harry would openly speak about the lasting impact of that funeral. He admitted that it had profoundly affected him, and that the world would no longer allow such a situation to unfold. Harry's candidness about his emotions and the public scrutiny he faced would echo the sentiments that Spencer had expressed for Diana. His willingness to break from royal protocol and to speak his truth was, in many ways, a testament to the earlier call to action that Spencer had made. However, the story did not end there. Behind the scenes, the initial hours of August 31, 1997, when the car crash occurred, were a time of chaotic uncertainty. The crash had been sudden, the black Mercedes that carried Diana tearing through the streets of Paris, chased by paparazzi who had relentlessly pursued her. The impact was brutal, the vehicle crumpling like a tin can. Within seconds, the world began to receive whispers that a most famous woman had been involved in an accident. The news spread rapidly, first as a whisper, then as a breaking headline that turned the world's focus to Paris. Behind this public flurry of headlines, another story unfolded in South Africa. Charles Spencer was in bed, half asleep, when the first call rang. The voice on the other end was calm, but firm. Diana had been in a car accident in Paris, severely injured. Spencer's mind raced, recalling the relentless media attention she had endured, the paparazzi who chased her relentlessly. His heart thumped, as he waited for confirmation. Minutes stretched into an hour, and a second call came. This time the voice was colder, the words more final, "I'm sorry, sir. She didn't make it." The reality hit him like a hammer. She was gone, and the blame lay with the paparazzi that had chased her that night. The reaction of the royal family at that moment was one of silence, a silence that would be misinterpreted by the public. While the people of Britain and the world were in open raw mourning, flowers piled up outside Buckingham Palace, people weeping in the streets, those at the top remained silent for hours, then days. No public statement, no national address, no visible sign of mourning. The royal family remained at Balmoral Castle, hidden from view. People assumed that shock had taken over, but as the days passed, the silence felt more like indifference. The flag at Buckingham Palace was not lowered to half-mast, Charles and the boys were not in London, the public's expectations were unmet. The newspapers, normally respectful of the monarchy, turned their headlines into accusations of betrayal. "Your people are mourning, where are you?" The papers screamed, demanding the royal family show the nation they cared. The British public, feeling abandoned, began to question their loyalty. The silence at the top, the lack of a public address, these were the first cracks in the monarchy's image of stability. Spencer's speech would reveal to the world that something deeper had been hidden behind that official silence, a truth that no one had dared to confront. He had stepped into that void, bringing his brother's voice to a stage where it would be heard by the world. The first nights after Diana's crash were a strange quiet, a hush that settled over Balmoral as if the castle itself were holding its breath. Two boys, William and Harry, sat by the fire, their faces drawn and eyes wide, while their father, Prince Charles, forced a smile that never quite reached his eyes. In the dim glow of the hearth, the weight of the world seemed too large for the young hearts. Harry, then just 12, pressed his palms to his ears, repeating the question that had haunted him for days. Is she gone? The answer came from his father's sigh, a gentle but firm voice that carried the knowledge of a secret too heavy for a child's mind. The brothers had spoken to Diana over the phone the previous day, a casual exchange of call later that now seemed like a cruel joke. For days, the palace walls became an invisible cage. The brothers were kept from the press, kept from the public eye. Their world narrowed to the garden of Balmoral, the hum of the hearth, and the presence of their father, grandmother, and a family that rarely showed emotion. The silence at the palace, however, did not go unnoticed. In London, flowers piled in front of Buckingham Palace, people wept in the streets, and the nation cried out for answers. Yet the royal family remained a step behind, their silence magnified by the lack of any public address. The Queen had no choice but to act. 5 days after the tragedy, on September 5th, she appeared before cameras, her voice steady, describing Diana as a remarkable human being, a loving mother. She praised her devotion to her 2 boys and spoke of the loss the nation had suffered. It was an attempt to bridge the divide, but for many, it felt too late. The monarchy had appeared cold and distant at a time when warmth was desperately needed. The gap between the royal institution and the people became more obvious than ever. The Queen's words, while respectful, failed to erase the perception that the monarchy had been out of touch. The funeral itself was perhaps the most painful and controversial moment in royal history. The decision to have William and Harry walk behind Diana's coffin was a moment that would change them forever. It was a choice that many within the palace disagreed with. One man in particular, Charles Spencer, fought fiercely to stop it. He believed the boys, at 15 and 12, were too young to bear the burden of walking in front of a world that had just witnessed a tragedy. He argued that the royal family was sending a message that was cruel and exploitative. His protests were met with resistance from palace officials, and in the end, the decision went through. The boys' presence behind the coffin, captured by millions of cameras, was traumatic for both of them. William later admitted that it was an experience no child should have to endure. The boys' sorrow was compounded by the fact that, for decades, Spencer had been the only one who had truly understood what Diana's death had meant for a child. Spencer's battle with the royal family continued beyond the funeral. He never agreed with the choice to have the boys walk behind the coffin. He argued with palace officials, stating that the ceremony was cruel. His protests were ignored. The royal family's decision not to listen to him left a lasting scar on the boy's psyche. Years later, William himself said that the funeral had traumatized him. Harry's trauma was even more profound. He had been compared to his mother, with the rebellious streak and warmth that made him a natural fit for the public. Yet the experience left a deep discomfort with the royal system that haunted him in later years. Harry's memory of the paparazzi, the relentless cameras, and the public's reaction to that night in 1997 would later shape his own choices. Charles Spencer's role as a critic of the royal family was more than a one-time protest. For years, he spoke out about how the institution had failed Diana. In interviews, he recalled how Diana was left to struggle alone, how her funeral had been handled, and how William and Harry were forced to walk behind her coffin. Spencer argued that no child should have to do that in front of millions. He was right. The royal family had not listened. The institutional failure became a narrative that transcended a single generation. Spencer's words still echo through the halls of the palace, a reminder that the tragedy was not just an isolated event but part of a larger pattern of treatment that had been inflicted on a member of the family. The sense of injustice that Spencer's criticism highlighted had a broader impact on the perception of the royal family. It was not only about the funeral or the decision to have the boys walk behind the coffin. It was also about the negative headlines, the attacks from within the palace, and the lack of support for Diana's family. The public, who had seen Diana's heart, the people who had mourned her death, had begun to question the very nature of the monarchy. Spencer's speeches were a form of protest against a system that seemed to treat a loved one as a duty rather than a person. He was the only voice that understood why the royal family had been so quick to distance itself from Diana, from the public, from the reality of her suffering. He had spent years speaking out about how the institution had failed her, and his voice remained a constant reminder that the tragedy lived on. Harry's own struggle with the monarchy would eventually reach a boiling point. He was compared to his mother, given her rebellious streak, warmth, and deep discomfort with the system. He never forgot how she had been treated. In interviews, he later admitted that every time he saw paparazzi cameras flashing, it took him back to that night in 1997. The trauma of witnessing the cameras at the funeral, the fear of history repeating itself, shaped his choices. He saw Meghan, his wife, facing the same kind of treatment. Meghan's experience, negative headlines, attacks from within the palace, lack of support, made Harry feel helpless to stop the same pattern. In one of his most emotional interviews, He said he saw history repeating itself, but unlike Diana, he could escape. He chose to leave the royal family. In 2020, Harry and Meghan made the shocking decision to leave the institution, moving to the United States, cutting official ties. It was the boldest move in modern royal history. For Harry, it wasn't rebellion, it was survival. He had followed his mother's path, refusing to let the same patterns repeat. Spencer quietly supported Harry's decision. He did not make public statements, but his silence was no longer a refusal to engage. It was a tacit understanding that Harry had spent decades criticizing the same system that he had now rejected. The shared narrative between Charles Spencer and Harry served as a bridge between generations, a reminder that the legacy of Diana was not simply about the past but about ongoing survival. Harry's departure with Meghan, the way he spoke of wanting to protect her from the same paparazzi nightmare, was a continuation of Diana's struggle to break free from the monarchy's constraints. While Diana had sought a new life outside royal duties and started speaking out about her own struggles, Harry finished what she had started, her path to redefining what it meant to be a royal. The truth that Charles Spencer revealed after 30 years was not just a statement about the boy's experience at the funeral or the monarchy's silence. It was a revelation of the institutional failure that had shaped the lives of a generation. Spencer's decades of criticism had finally found resonance in Harry's actions. It was a closing of a loop, a reconciliation between the past and the present. For viewers, the revelation felt like a secret finally exposed, a truth that had been hidden for 3 decades. The sense that the monarchy had failed its own people and that the only way to right that wrong was to leave, to break, to rebuild, was powerful. In the end, the story of Princess Diana's brother and Harry's departure is one of survival, of breaking the patterns that had bound them for so long. The brothers who had suffered in silence at Balmoral, the public's anger, the Queen's late speech, the controversial funeral, Spencer's battle and the continued criticism, and finally, Harry's bold decision to step away, all pieces of a larger puzzle that now fits into a more complete picture. The truth after 30 years is that the tragedy did not end with Diana's death, it lived on. Through the words of her brother and the actions of her son. It was the final reveal that finally put the truth in plain sight. In the months that followed, Harry's departure was not merely a shift in residence, it became a seismic recalibration of what it meant to be a royal in the 21st century. The decision had rippled through the halls of Windsor, the corridors of Buckingham, and the living rooms of people worldwide. The quiet of the palace walls, once filled with whispered apologies and unspoken grievances, was now punctuated by a new kind of silence. One that resonated with the quiet resolve that had driven Harry out. The move to California was both practical and symbolic. It provided a shield from the relentless paparazzi that had haunted his life since the early days of his marriage, but more importantly, it offered a fresh canvas on which he could paint a future that did not revolve around protocol. He settled into a modest home in the San Fernando Valley, a place that, for the first time, felt unburdened by the expectations of royalty. The sense of liberation was palpable, a relief that had been years in the making. Yet even in the quiet of his new life, Harry found himself drawn to the very issues that had haunted his father and later, his brother. He began to use his platform to advocate for mental health awareness, a cause that had personal resonance after witnessing his brother's struggles. In public statements, he referenced the trauma that had permeated his family's history, the fear that each generation was walking the same perilous path. He spoke of the weight of expectations, the invisible chains that bound his people, and the imperative to break those chains for future generations. The public's reaction was a mixture of empathy and skepticism. Some celebrated his courage, seeing him as a figure who had finally chosen authenticity over image. Others, entrenched in the traditionalist view of the monarchy, accused him of betrayal. Regardless, his voice was no longer muffled by the palace's careful curation. He could address people directly, his words unfiltered and in many ways, more potent than the scripted speeches he had delivered at the royal palaces. Back at Windsor, the dynamics shifted as well. The royal family, though still grappling with the loss of Prince Philip, began to confront the legacy of its own failures. In the wake of Harry's departure, the Queen, who had been a pillar of stoic resilience, issued a rare public statement. She acknowledged the pain that had been endured by those within the palace walls, admitting that the institution had not always lived up to its own ideals. Her words, delivered from the comfort of a private setting, were a quiet acknowledgement that the past could not simply be swept aside. The contrast between the Queen's measured response and Harry's impassioned pleas highlighted the evolving nature of the monarchy's relationship with the public. The institution, once perceived as unassailable, was now being forced to reckon with its own shortcomings. Yet the conversation was not one of condemnation, it was a conversation about accountability, healing, and the need for systemic change. In the years that followed, Harry and Meghan became more than just former royals. They emerged as advocates for a cause that transcended borders. Their move to the United States, initially seen as a retreat, evolved into an active campaign. They partnered with various charities, including those focused on mental health, child welfare, and the press freedom movement. Their story was amplified by journalists who had, over decades, been wary of their proximity to the palace. With the weight of their experience, they brought a nuanced perspective to discussions about media ethics and the rights of individuals. The narrative surrounding Princess Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, also shifted. Where once his criticism had been a quiet whisper in the shadows, his voice now echoed through the public sphere. He, too, found a renewed platform to speak about the systemic failings that had plagued his family. His decades of research and advocacy, now corroborated by Harry's own testimony, resonated with a generation that was more attuned to institutional accountability. Spencer's interviews, initially conducted in hushed rooms, became broadcasts that reached millions, further cementing his role as a catalyst for change. As the world watched, the ripple effects of this new era were visible in several arenas. In the media, there was a discernible shift in how stories about the royal family were covered. Reporters began to ask questions about the structure of the institution, its handling of mental health, and the role of the press in shaping public perception. The narrative moved away from sensationalism toward a more humanistic approach, offering deeper insight into the personal lives of those who had once been shrouded in mystery. In politics, the monarchy's role in governance continued to be scrutinized. Politicians, previously reticent to engage with the royal family, now found themselves in conversations about the intersection of tradition and modernity. The public, informed by the frank admissions of both the Queen and former members of the household, demanded greater transparency. While the monarchy remained an emblem of continuity, it also faced pressure to adapt, to become a reflection of contemporary values. For the younger generation, the story of Harry and Meghan was transformative. Their journey became a touchstone for discussions about identity, agency, and the courage to defy societal expectations. The narrative that had once been dominated by images of pageantry was replaced with a story of resilience, of a family that had chosen to redefine themselves beyond the constraints of a throne. Schools began incorporating their story into curricula about media literacy and civic engagement, using their experience as a case study in how institutions can evolve when confronted with their own contradictions. In the private realm, the bonds between the various members of the royal family grew strained but also more honest. While the Queen continued to honor the traditions she had cherished, she also faced the reality that her people had changed. The lines of communication, once rigid, were now more flexible, allowing for a space where grievances could be aired without fear of public spectacle. The palace, in turn, began to re-evaluate its protocols, especially those that had previously seemed to protect the institution at the expense of personal well-being. And yet, perhaps the most profound change was in the collective memory of the monarchy. The narrative that had been built over centuries, a narrative that placed Diana as a tragic figure, her brother as a silent witness, and Harry as a dutiful heir, was rewritten. It became a story of an entire family that had endured grief, had fought for mental health advocacy, and had ultimately chosen to reclaim their agency. The truth that had been buried for 30 years now stood at the forefront, a testament to the power of perseverance. In interviews that followed, Harry spoke often of the sense of closure that the revelations had brought. He described a feeling of relief, a recognition that the cycle of pain could finally be broken. "It's not about erasing the past," he said, "but about learning from it, and ensuring that the future is guided by compassion, not protocol." His words echoed the sentiment that had been present in the quiet corners of his brother's memories, an understanding that survival meant more than just stepping away, it meant confronting the roots of the system that had caused so much suffering. As the years progressed, the world continued to observe the evolving narrative. The legacy of Princess Diana, her brother's courageous testimony, and Harry's bold departure became a mosaic that illuminated the complexity of monarchy in a modern world. The palace, no longer an isolated entity, became a living institution that had to respond to the voices of those it claimed to serve. In the end, the story did not end with a single revelation or a single decision. It was an ongoing conversation, a dialogue that spanned decades, that involved countless individuals, and that resonated with audiences worldwide. The truth, once concealed beneath layers of protocol and privacy, had finally been set free, shining a light on the intertwined destinies of a family and a nation. The tragedy that had once seemed confined to the night of Diana's funeral had, in truth, been a ripple that reached far beyond. The words of her brother, the actions of her son, and the courage of those who followed them had carved a new path. The palace, once a fortress of tradition, now faced the challenge of becoming a space where truth and compassion could coexist. And for the people of the world, the story became a powerful reminder that change is possible, even when it comes from the most unexpected places. The tragedy that had once seemed confined to the night of Diana's funeral had, in truth, been a ripple that reached far beyond. The words of her brother, the actions of her son, and the courage of those who followed them had carved a new path. The palace, once a fortress of tradition, now faced the challenge of becoming a space where truth and compassion could coexist. And for the people of the world, the story became a powerful reminder that change is possible, even when it comes from the most unexpected places.